Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a real honor to be here. It's always good to be in the company of people who are smarter than yourselves, and that is certainly true for me today. I will deviate somewhat off the topic today. I will not be talking about academic freedom or censorship in the sciences. I will be talking about free speech more generally. And as was mentioned, specifically about what I call the global free speech recession and maybe some historical lessons that we can use to better understand and, who knows, maybe even reverse it. But before doing so, I want to start off with some hopefully easy questions to you all in the audience. So, by a show of hands, how many of you support democracy? How many of you support same-sex marriage? How many of you are in favor of equality before the law, regardless of sex or race or religion? Great, so we have universal acceptance of these values and principles, at least in this room, and we take them for granted, but we forget that these values were won by champions who paid a price, sometimes the highest price, along the way, so that we can enjoy them today. And the most powerful weapon was, most of the time, not guns or political power, because they didn't have it. It was speech, it was words. But unfortunately today, free speech is under attack. The lines between free and unfree societies are blurring. And to understand what's at stake, I want to start with two stories of two dissidents, one who triumphed and one who didn't. So I want to start in 1990, where Václav Havel, the great Czechoslovakian dissident, stood triumphantly before the US Congress and recounted the rather incredible story of how just months ago he had been sitting in prison in a totalitarian communist state, but now he was standing as president of a country with full freedom of speech. Now, Havel had actually paved the way himself with some of his dissidents by the famous manifesto Charter 77, and the very first freedom that they called for in that charter was freedom of expression. And during those decades, free speech became a trump in a global winning streak for free speech and freedom over authoritarianism around the world. And you know, democracies started to see free speech as a competitive advantage against authoritarian states, and tyrants were on the defensive. And then something great happened in the 1990s, the World Wide Web. That gave an enormous amount of optimism that technology would supercharge free speech and essentially make the 21st century resistant to censorship and authoritarianism. But it didn't quite turn out that way. So here is Liu Xiaobo, who was a Chinese dissident who was so inspired by the Charter 77 that he and other Chinese dissidents drafted the Charter 08 in 2008. And that called for democracy and free speech in China. But unlike Havel, Liu Xiaobo did not live to see his vision realized. He was arrested and he died in prison. And of course, the Chinese Communist power is firmly in power today in China. And I think these two stories reveal the stark contrast between societies that are built on free and open inquiry and those that are built on censorship and control. And fast forward today, and authoritarianism, unfortunately, is on the march. A lot of the gains that were made during the so-called third wave of democratization have, as you can see on this time lapse, been eliminated. There was, you see, if we start back in 1994, you see more and more countries becoming lighter, indicating less respect for free speech. In 2023, you saw quite alarming tendencies globally. And one of the most alarming things, I think, is that open democracies who used to see free speech as a competitive advantage now increasingly have this tendency to view free speech in the digital age as sort of a Trojan horse, as more of a threat than the foundation to democratic governance. So, in other words, the golden age of free speech is in retreat and has given way to a free speech recession. And so I'll try to provide 5 lessons from history that can sort of try to explain this and maybe even, as I said, provide hints on how to reverse it. So the first lesson is elite panic. And to understand what I mean by that, we have to go back to the birthplace of democracy in the ancient world. So the ancient Athenian democracy, some 2,500 years ago, had two conceptions actually of free speech. One of them called isagoria, meaning equality of speech. Every freeborn male citizen had a right to participate directly in democratic deliberation. And they also had parousia, meaning fearless speech. That was what Socrates practiced in the marketplace when he was roasting his fellow Athenians. The Athenian model was essentially a very egalitarian, bottom-up conception of free speech. Relatively speaking, not compared to our days, they did have slaves, they didn't allow women to speak and so on, but for its time, it was radically egalitarian. The Roman Republic, on the other hand, was very different. The Romans cherished their free speech, but it was to be exercised by the wealthy, well-educated elite, people like Cicero and Cato. So if you went to a Roman assembly, the ordinary citizen did not have a right to speak. They were addressed by the magistrate, and they had a right to vote yes or no. So essentially, the Roman conception of free speech was top-down, elitist. So we have these two conceptions, egalitarian and elitist free speech. And those two conceptions of free speech are constantly in tension with each other. And that's where elite panic sets in. So every time the public sphere is expanded through new technology or giving a voice to previously marginalized, shut-off groups, the institutional gatekeepers fret about the consequences. What will happen when we give a voice to the unwashed mobs? Women, African Americans, non-Protestants, and so on and so on. And we've seen this again and again throughout history. So obviously, a huge game changer is the printing press. And the great humanist scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam was one of the most prolific publishers. He wrote many a treatise and a book, and initially he hailed the printing press. But then an honorary monk in Germany decided to upend history and splinter Christendom with his Reformation, Martin Luther. And he used the printing press more effectively than probably anyone else in human history. If he was on Twitter today, he would have more followers than Elon Musk, and all of it grown organic. But you can see Erasmus of Rotterdam completely changes his mind. Suddenly, the printing press that had been this instrument for good is now libelous, mad, impious, and subversive. And then came the transatlantic telegraph. Suddenly, you could send information across continents in a matter of minutes rather than weeks or months. Now, that didn't go well, down too well at the New York Times because, it's too superficial, sudden, unsifted for the truth, telegraphic intelligence. Why do you need to have information in minutes when you can wait for weeks? And you can basically change the word telegraph, insert social media or internet, and you can find probably 5 op-eds printed today that make the same argument. But we also see it in our digital age. So here's the junior senator from Illinois making the case that the internet is great. He can say what he wants without censorship. And Obama probably is the one who revolutionizes the use of the internet and social media to connect with younger voters, to circumvent the traditional elites in his party, and he wins the so-called Facebook generation. Very interesting to read about the relationship between Silicon Valley and Obama at the time. It was a different narrative than the one surrounding the relationship between Donald Trump and Silicon Valley today. But fast forward to 2020, after the election, after Donald Trump goes off with his lies and conspiracy theories, and Obama, the statesman, finds that the internet and social media, online disinformation, is the greatest threat to democracy. Essentially, the same infrastructure that helped bring him to power is now a threat. In the age of AI, we see this a lot. 2024 was famously the super election year, and there have been endless warnings about how AI would supercharge disinformation and drown the elections of 2 billion people around the world in disinformation. In EU, the World Economic Forum named it the greatest short-term threat to humanity, nonetheless. What happened, of course, was that none of these global elections were drowned by disinformation or AI. There's certainly stuff out there that's bad and false, but we have not seen sort of evidence of this impacting elections as was threatened. So this is a good example of how elite panic, which can be, it can be born out of real concerns. The printing press did not lead to instant stability. There were religious wars. Social media today can certainly fuel polarization, but very often what we see with elite panic is that the cure becomes worse than the disease, and there's a tendency to wildly exaggerate the danger and adopt solutions that are illiberal and that where the institutional gatekeepers, to use a term that is often used in a different context, punches down on the population below, the unwashed mob. So lesson number 2 is what I call Milton's curse. Now, why would I call name a curse after John Milton? He is, after all, the author of Areopagitica from 1644, a great and timeless defense of press freedom, which is eloquently written, eminently quotable even today. Many of the arguments are timeless. But when you read John Milton more closely, so Areopagitica is basically written as a protest against Parliament's reintroduction of censorship in England. But when you read it more closely, you find that John Milton is not in favor of press freedom for all. If you're Catholic, you need not apply. If you're seditious, you need not apply. Essentially, John Milton means press freedom for mainline Protestant sects to discuss their issues. And the ultimate irony, of course, is that John Milton ends up serving as a censor under the military dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell, albeit he was supposedly a mild censor. So Milton's curse is this recurrent phenomenon that we see again and again, where even champions of free speech have a selective, unprincipled commitment to free speech. Free speech for me, but not for thee. And all human beings are prone to that, and we have a canny ability to come up and rationalize arguments for why, in this particular case, free speech should not be extended to a particular group. That if you start making those arguments, check yourself for whether you've been afflicted by Milton's curse. Milton's curse is also alive today. So this is Texas Governor Greg Abbott. In 2019, he was concerned about some of the same things that you people in the room were concerned about. Cancel culture, wokeism run amok, and so he signed a law to strengthen free speech on college campuses in Texas. So far, so good. October 7 happens. Abbott goes out, signs a sweeping executive order that I think the good people at FIRE have challenged, which essentially adopted an extremely broad and vague definition of anti-Semitism that universities had to crack down on. So free speech was good before, in 2019, something that we want to challenge. We want to crack down on the wokist leftist lunatics who have taken over the asylum, but there also has to be limits, and Abbott was happy to define those limits. What about those on the receiving end of Abbott's ire? The Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, they were targeted by lawmakers and administrators in many cases. They And as you can see in this statement, they were outraged. This was a crackdown on political speech, an unprecedented crackdown on political speech. But the Students for Justice in Palestine have spent a lot of their time cracking down on political speech themselves, trying to actively cancel anyone who might have said anything remotely positive about Israel from college campuses. So a perfect example of Milton's curse on both the right and the left, and which ultimately serves to hollow out the principle of free speech. Neither Texas governor or the Students for Justice in Palestine have much credibility when it comes to free speech, quite frankly, because they're not willing to extend it to those that they disagree with. Here's another prominent example. Elon Musk has marketed himself as the champion of free speech in the digital age, who has restored free speech to social media, and he talks about it a lot. But he's also happy to sue, the world's richest man sues nonprofits who say bad things about X. And he's also more than happy to comply with requests from foreign governments to close down accounts. This includes the Turkish President Erdogan, hardly a friend of free speech or democracy. So very shortly before the Turkish presidential election, where there was actually a chance that Erdogan could have lost, which would have been a big deal, the Turkish government called up Elon Musk and said, hey, can you close down these opposition politicians? And Elon Musk complied. And he's done that on a number of occasions, in addition to gaming his own platform to amplify his own voice and crack down on people that he don't like. So again, Milton's curse is a very, very powerful explainer for why we cannot just have free speech as human beings. I think it is probably something that we will never eliminate from human beings. I think all of us have it within us, but if we're at least aware of it, we can call it out and we can try to self-police and try to avoid the worst excesses of Milton's curse. All right, let's go to lesson number 3. It's what I call the Weimar fallacy. So a seemingly compelling reason why all mature democracies, except the US, have laws against hatred and extremism is the very understandable wish to want to avoid the horrors of Nazism that culminated in the Holocaust in Germany. After all, the Nazis came into power through democratic means. And so the argument goes, we need a militant democracy that is intolerant to the intolerant and that we should not extend speech rights to those who will take those rights away. But this skips over some rather important parts of German history of the Weimar Republic, the fragile democratic republic from 1918 to 1933. Because even though the Weimar Republic protected free speech, it also had rather serious limitations. And as it hurled towards its destruction, it adopted more and more desperate emergency laws to try and keep communists and Nazis in check. All these factions who actually fought to take over the German state, famously a democracy without democrats, as some have said. And these laws would allow the German government to close down newspapers administratively if they spread false information, if they attacked the government. And very frequently, the Nazis were on the receiving end. So Joseph Goebbels, who would later become propaganda minister in the Third Reich, when Adolf Hitler was banned from speaking in Germany, he founded a newspaper, an anti-Semitic newspaper called Der Angriff, the attack. And he would boast proudly about how Der Angriff was the most prominently censored, the most frequently censored newspaper in Germany. So he basically used it as a propaganda tactic. And we know that from populist movement today, that if you can sort of claim the mantle of being censored, that's a very powerful rallying cry. Well, the Nazis were very good at that. Julius Streicher, the editor of Der Stürmer, probably the most anti-Semitic newspaper in history, was twice convicted under something resembling an early hate speech law, and he used that as a propaganda vehicle as well. But most perniciously was that when the Nazis came into power, they used the very laws that were supposed to protect democracy to abolish democracy. So the Weimar Republic's constitution had a provision, Article 48, which allowed the president to suspend all civil liberties in an emergency. And so Hitler leaned on President Hindenburg after the Parliament building was burned down and said, you got to suspend this. We have a threat from the communists. And that provided the pretext for the Nazis to essentially eliminate all opposition. And within a very short time period, they had created a totalitarian one-party state. So that at least should complicate this seductive idea that in order to fight totalitarianism, we need restrictions on free speech. But there's also a positive case to be made, not just one about the consequences. And that is that, I'm sure you've heard this on college campuses a lot, that free speech and equality are mutually exclusive, or at least in conflict. But in my opinion, history shows the opposite. Free speech and equality are mutually reinforcing. I would go so far as to say that free speech may be the most powerful engine of equality that our species has stumbled upon. And I've included this pantheon of great heroes and champions of equality, of freedom, of democracy, and without exception, all of them championed free speech. Take Frederick Douglass, my favorite American of all time, who said, among many things, that the right of speech is a precious one, especially for the oppressed. Or take Gandhi. Gandhi in 1921 was sentenced to 5 years in prison by the British for for sedition, for his peaceful advocacy. And he said in his trial, he said, free speech should, you should be free to criticize any idea, any person, so long as you don't advocate for violence. Now, this comes close to the current protection of the First Amendment. But when he said that, when Gandhi said that in 1921, if you're an American and you had criticized American involvement in World War I, you could go to prison for 10 years. So Gandhi was a radical. He was far beyond the extension of protection of free speech under the First Amendment at the time. Mandela, shortly before becoming president of a free multiracial democracy in South Africa, gave a speech where he said, well, free speech was absolutely essential in shining a light on the evils of apartheid, giving a voice to those who were silenced, because censorship was a huge part of the apartheid regime. And he said that any restrictions on free speech is a disservice to democracy, and that free speech would be a cornerstone of South African democracy. So far from being a danger to minorities, free speech is essential for their thriving. And we can see the pernicious consequences even today. So in many European democracies where we have well-intentioned laws against hate speech. So this is an example from the UK. This is a British woman of South Asian origin who was at a demonstration. She held up a placard of the then Prime Minister, who was also of South Asian origin, and called him a coconut, essentially. Now, that might not be very progressive when you think about it, because it basically says that the color of your skin should, define your political opinions. But nonetheless, this is standard fare political criticism. But she was put on trial and charged with hate speech. She was ultimately acquitted, but other people have been convicted for similar things. We've also seen a lot of Black Britons who have been, had police show up in their apartments when they've sent gifs or memes that are sort of sarcastically racist, if you like, or where they appropriate racist terms in online debates. In Germany, Iris Hefetz is an Israeli Jew. She is very on the far left. She thinks Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. You can agree or disagree with that position, but she has been arrested at least on 4 occasions for standing in Berlin with a placard that says, "Stop the genocide in Gaza," or similar messages. So I don't know about you, but the optics of an Israeli Jew being arrested by 10 police officers in Berlin, are you doing the right thing? It's ironic at least. And many such examples, like an American author who fled to Germany a long time ago, became a cantankerous critic of COVID policies, published a book with a cover that has a barely visible swastika, published it online, and was convicted for using an anti-constitutional symbol, even though he was quite obviously not advocating for Nazism, but making a rather hyperbolic comparison between COVID policies and Nazism. So that's the state of free speech in many European countries, and I would say it's only getting worse in Europe. So lesson 4 is decentralization. So one of the theses in my book is that free speech tends to thrive when control over information and ideas is decentralized, whereas if you have centralized control, free speech tends to suffer. And we can see that in a number of ways. So take the printing press. So you can see the number of printing presses grows in a very short number of time, and the book production also increases. This has consequences for literacy around Europe. And what does that mean? That means that, as more and more people learn to read, more and more books become available. Each of them become a potential vector of new ideas that can then spread more rapidly. And the more printing presses and books you have and more people with different ideas, the more difficult it becomes to control it. So that's why a censor in the Catholic Church said, what we need is a halt to printing so that the church can catch up with this deluge of publication. So even though the Catholic Church had developed what he thought was a very rigorous system of censorship, it could not follow up with developments because printing presses were so dispersed. The Dutch Republic is a very powerful example of this. So the Dutch Republic in the late 16th century, the 17th century, and the early 18th century consisted of 7 provinces. There was no strong centralized power in the Dutch Republic. They didn't have a First Amendment. They didn't have laws protecting free speech, but they had because there was no centralized power, they became the printing house of Europe. They became a bit like a VPN. So you would go to the Dutch Republic, you'd publish books that were banned in other countries, and you'd smuggle them across borders into France, into Germany, where these things would be banned. And this had immense consequences for science, for progress. I think it would be quite difficult to imagine the Enlightenment without the central role of the Dutch Republic as sort of a vector that could spread ideas challenging the status quo on a number of central things. And that one of the reasons for that was the decentralized political nature of the Dutch Republic. Then we have the First Amendment. Now, for a very long time, the First Amendment didn't have any real legal teeth, but it still had sort of a preventive role in that. And a good example of this is in the 1830s. So in the 1830s, there's a huge concern in southern states about abolitionist material. So all southern states included draconian bans on abolitionist speech. So you would go to prison. I think Georgia actually had the death penalty. I don't know that anyone was ever executed, but if you spread abolitionist ideas in the southern states, you were in trouble. And so President Andrew Jackson said, hey, we're going to adopt a federal law that prohibits the Postal Service from distributing abolitionist materials in southern states. And Congress says, no, that would violate the First Amendment. Even southern states will sort of say, maybe we're pushing it too far because this can be abused to other things. So what this does is that it allows the states to have very different speech regimes. So someone like Frederick Douglass, having escaped the South, can set up shop, start his own newspaper in northern states, and disseminate his ideas. So that means a decentralized regime of free speech protections by the First Amendment, even though it would not actually be applied by the courts until much later. The internet speaks for itself. I want to spend a little bit of time on AI because we're, after all, living in the AI era. And I think decentralization of AI is probably more important. It's a hugely important topic, especially as generative AI is now being embedded into search, word processing, email, basically the whole way that we interact and mediate with information and ideas. And so I think there are two competing ways, because there's a lot of talk about regulation of AI, and I think there are two competing ways you can think about it. So one of them would be what we might call preventive safetyism. So that would be the idea that we need to regulate AI in such a way that we ensure that we prevent all downstream harms. So AI can help disseminate disinformation, hate speech, all kinds of other types of content that we don't like, and therefore we need powerful regulators, and we need that to be embedded, filtered, censored in the models. And you can imagine opening up your laptop, writing your paper, and then Word says, well, I can't save your file because the content violates our content policies. Or sending an email, and it says, well, Outlook says, I can't send your email because what you've written violates our content policies. Sounds science fiction, but this is entirely possible, happens already with spam, for instance. A good example of this is Google's Gemini. So if you ask Gemini whether Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been called a fascist, it refuses to generate a response. Why does it do that? Because when Gemini answered this question, factually correct, by saying, yes, some people have called Modi a fascist, the Indian government put pressure on Google and said, hey, you can't allow that. You got to censor your models because otherwise you violate Indian laws. So, this is a potentially hugely dangerous development, which threatens not only freedom of speech, access to information, but even freedom of thought. The other side of that is what we might call user empowerment, where we say that freedom of speech and access to information should be a critical part of how we govern AI. Here's another example of that. So Belarus is obviously a very brutal dictatorship. The Belarus opposition has been entirely purged. So what did they do? Well, they created an AI-generated bot that they fielded as a candidate in the tainted presidential election, and so people in Belarus could interact with a candidate which actually espoused pro-democracy views. Obviously, could not win the election, but this is a way of decentralized AI of what I call user empowerment. There are many other ways to sort of improving reliability on Wikipedia and so on. And I think, so basically the decentralization in the age that we live in now is essential. I also think it's essential for social media. I'm actually quite supportive of Meta's move towards crowdsourcing rather than official fact checkers. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it can actually work. The last lesson I want to leave you with is to give the word to one of your colleagues, if we may call him that, Albert Einstein, who talked about the importance of a culture of free speech. So he says that laws alone cannot secure freedom of expression. In order that every man may present his views without penalty, there must be a spirit of tolerance in the entire population. And I think that is your central challenge, right? If you can convince a critical mass of students, faculty, administrators, okay, not administrators, but student and faculty, that free speech and academic freedom are the most central ideals for higher education, you're likely to win the battle. If you can't, you're likely to lose. So I think that's your main challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the insightful talk. We have time for a few questions. So, yeah, the person with the white shirt over there.
Check.
Okay.
Dr. Mchangama, your book is fantastic. I have a question to you regarding a new phenomena we have in the modern world regarding free speech, social media. I'm very curious as to your opinion as to how we handle this technology in the modern era. I don't agree with the idea that social media like X is something like the printing press, because although it allows the dissemination of information, there's an algorithm that focuses what we can consume, and it also deranges people. On top of that, there's an argument that it's a private platform, and whoever is in charge of it can dictate the terms and how it can be used. That being said, the argument can be made that it is the quote-unquote new public square. I am partial to this view, but I'm not entirely sold on it. So with this new technology in the public eye, can these principles of decentralization be used to ensure maximum free speech while also ensuring that it doesn't clash with the other rights we enjoy in a liberal democracy?
Yeah, I think decentralization is part of the solution. So remember the time before centralized social media, like the blogosphere, for instance. No one, if you had the most successful blog in the world, no one would care about how it was moderated, right? You care about how Facebook is moderated because it's a centralized platform and the decisions they make have outsized impact on the practical exercise of free speech for literally billions of people. So if you have a more decentralized ecosystem of social media, the decisions about content moderation become less consequential. And it also allows us to have spaces where you can say, well, it's not a problem if you have a social media space that wants to have a very narrow focus, and then you can go somewhere else where you have much wider room for all kinds of debates. Another way to fuel that is to provide users more control over the type of content that they want to be confronted with. So these are essentially, you could argue, back to the roots of a more egalitarian bottom-up approach to free speech rather than a top-down approach. But I would still say I think that the printing press was far more consequential and disruptive for our species than social media. I think social media it's not inconsequential compared to the printing press, but it's far less significant. And I think we are likely to look back in 10 and 20 years and say, well, some of those debates that we had were maybe a little bit overblown. The whole idea that the 2016 election was decided by Russian propaganda is essentially now discredited by a number of papers, rigorous papers, even though that headline dominated for such a long time, right?
Next question. Just in front over there, the white shirt man. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Maybe I'll stand up. Sorry. I'm David Camper. I'm from UCLA. I think one of the points that you make about AI is that there's actually recent legislation that was vetoed by Governor Newsom recently because there was sort of a question about frontier models with AI regulation. One of those points was, well, we have to sort of consider what models and what type of tokenization techniques down the future might actually be able to, we may be able to develop AI modeling. And so there was a lot of thinking, and there is still a lot of thinking about what kind of frontier models. And one of the people who's most of the I guess the biggest proponent of considering regulation is Jeff Hinton himself, who
Yes.
was or is the godfather of AI, just won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work in neural networks. And so I guess what is it to say that the most preeminent guy who more or less created AI through neural network analysis, and then plus this development of frontier modeling and fine-tuning these, which is, okay, you don't need to consider what Google, but Google can give you an API and you can sort of tinker with what you want to be able to do. There's a lot of work saying we can't let people sort of fine-tune a model because the frontier models might be a huge problem. And then you've got the biggest proponents saying we really need governments to sort of regulate frontier models. What is it one to say about the most preeminent person to
No, I think there's my argument is not that there should be no regulation of AI. There's a huge difference, in my opinion, between saying, oh, we want to ensure that AI cannot generate political deep fakes. Or saying, we don't want AI, we have to guard against catastrophic risks, such as, AI building chemical weapons or the likes. So that's, you also have limits on free speech even under the First Amendment. So I'm not arguing that there should be no limits whatsoever on AI. And in fact, what has surprised me is that most of the conversation around AI regulation focuses so little on free speech and access to information. They focus, with the exception of disinformation and deepfakes, they focus on a lot of other things. And I'm talking about a relatively small corner of the, all the potential harms and dangers that you can that you can think about, especially those that are related to what you might call sort of core speech. So I'm not saying that there should be no regulation at all. I don't know. I think there are very few people who hold that position.
Okay, next person in front. Yeah.
Ben Slifka from Seattle, software guy. I just want to remind people there are almost 200 countries in the world, and any legislation we might do here, the Chinese or the Russians or et cetera can do things as well. So yeah, keep that in mind.
Next question. Yeah, John.
I wonder if you could say a little more about the cultural point you made before. And I'm just wondering how you think what cultural factors lead free speech to be taken less seriously or more seriously? We all know that if you're an academic in the US and you value free speech, you can join FIRE, you can join HXA, albeit with a draconian membership pledge. But I'm wondering, but I'm really wondering is with England, like a lot of us have been watching events in England and some of these arrests and some of this this crackdown. Has the culture there changed? Can you say something, maybe use an English case as an example, as to what kind of cultural changes what cultural factors endanger free speech or culture of free speech, and what changes might improve
We're actually coming out with a survey on attitudes towards free speech in 30 plus countries in very soon. So it's a repeat of a study that we did in 2021. And just from looking at the initial results, I think you'll see that overall attitudes have become more hesitant about free speech. And I think you see some of the tendencies that are well known, that younger generations tend to be less enamored with free speech than older ones. I don't have a perfect solution for that. One of the things that I think free speech advocates have been poor at is, free speech advocates are very good at coming up with principled arguments for why free speech is bad. I can talk for hours about, this happened, you adopt this law and this happened, and abolitionists depended on free speech and so on. And those are good. I think they're an important part of the puzzle. But there are a lot of people who are, they feel threatened. When you feel threatened, you're much more likely to compromise free speech. You see it as sort of a luxury belief because you feel that there are harms that are concrete, tangible here and now, and you're willing to sacrifice what you view as an abstract value. So one of the things that we've tried to work on a bit at the Future of Free Speech is saying, okay, how do we concretely, how do we produce something tangible where we show the benefits of free speech, not just at an abstract level? So we've developed these toolkits, for instance, on countering hate speech through counter speech. And so we've trained hundreds of people around the world, dissidents, activists, on saying, okay, rather than calling up your government or calling your social media network to try and shut down people you don't like, here are some tools empowered by free speech that you can use to counter hate speech, for instance. And I think there are many such things. There are great, something called ground news, which looks at news stories and sort of has sort of an algorithm that says, this is slanted towards the right and the left. So it gives you sort of a better information environment, empowers you to make decisions about it, rather than the sort of the heavy-handed solution of saying, oh, we need to shut down fake news or disinformation and the like. And, again, crowdsourcing, I think, is another good example. It's free speech access to information, but distributed and not centralized. And I think making those, concrete, specific products, if you like, is something that free speech advocates have to do a lot more, in addition to making the principled arguments or, Greg's red-hot winning streak of court cases. That's also important.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yeah, over here.
John Landrum from Florida International University. It seems to me that if you think about what we see politically going on today, that there is a great deal of difference between your free speech, my free speech, and Elon Musk's free speech, or any other individual who has a high profile. It seems like there's a great deal of amplification of free speech depending upon a variety of factors, not just one factor. I mean, Elon controls X, of course, but this goes to the heart of is there really free speech? Because if your speech isn't as equitable as someone else's, then your message isn't coming across as clearly. So free speech is a hierarchy.
Yeah, well, I don't know how you saw that because, if you go to the Athenian assembly, in principle, everyone, even the lowest born Athenian citizen had a right to speech. But in practice, there would be orators who dominated because of their eloquence or because their respectability. So I think it would be impossible to sort of have perfectly egalitarian free speech where, I don't know, you'd have like a centralized authority saying, you have 500 Facebook comments each every year. So I think that's probably an unavoidable problem, but I still think that we have better opportunity to penetrate into the public sphere today than we had before. Think about, how often would an ordinary person, in the age before the internet, you could stand on a soapbox in your neighborhood and you could speak, but otherwise you really depended on a journalist or an editor to sort of open the gates to the public sphere for you to get your message out there. So yes, there are all kinds of ways that speech can be unequal in our digital sphere, but I still think that it has opened the way for many more voices to be heard. And some of those voices are not very pleasant, but that's again, that's a feature, not a bug of free speech.
Okay, let's stop here. Let's thank Jacob again.